interpretations, but I think we'll know pretty quickly. Good point. So, yes.
Tim, you ready to start?
Yeah. Are you confused, David? She's no JavaScribe, so she's going to sit near the JavaScribe. Oh yeah, I'd give you mine, but yeah. So, all right, we're getting close to 1:30, so we'll let people sort of drift in and stuff like that. And if somebody sitting way in the back sort of slacking off could actually pull the door shut as well, so we don't soil the others having to listen to us. So I'm Tim, and ask me about my broth. Welcome to Ideas. These pins are sort of great. Identities, identifiers, management sort of thing. So I'm Tim, that's Brian. If you were in DNS Privacy yesterday, this is the same crew. And I'm going to let Brian speak this time because yesterday I didn't let him talk at all. So a little Penn and Teller thing going on. So Alvaro is our ISG overlord, and I thank him for inviting us to this sort of shenanigans. Suzanne Wolf is doing JavaScribe, and we've got actually 3-minute takers. Torlis, Uma, and there's one other. So could you please raise your hand so I can see you guys? And oh, sweet, thank you, people. You people are wonderful. And so when people do come to the mic, please state your name so they can sort of track that. They're doing it all in Etherpad, so you can kind of follow along and add your own comments as well, sort of thing. Updated Noel. You guys have seen this is Wednesday afternoon, so I think we've all seen this before. So, and actually it's the new text. I'm pretty sure I updated that one. And there should be some blue sheets going around. And since this is a BOF, we want to get everybody to get their names in there so we can tell the Secretariat, yes, there's interest. You know, you guys want to do something, move forward with this, you know, and there's actually real people sitting in here doing stuff. So, very short agenda. A little bit of a bashing. Why are we here? Brian's going to give you the sort of little rundown. Sort of, Hasman's going to talk about the problem statement. Bob Moskowitz has got a couple of examples he wants to do show and tell with. Discussion on gap analysis, and then sort of open discussion. I know you all have been sort of working on sort of some charter text, and I took a look at it before the meeting, and the only comment I can say is less is more. So, you know, as someone who's done, you know, sort of these new working groups, you want to be vague and allow yourself some flexibility, but not sort of, you know, force you, you know, you're not trying to boil all the oceans. You may want to try to boil one ocean, but, you know, first you've just got to prove that you can actually get the water going. So that's my only advice. So, and Brian's got, from being a former AD, he's got some really great sage advice he's sort of waiting to share. So, but Brian wants to chat about why we're here, and so sort of give that. So anyway, thank you all for being here, and so I look forward to sort of a lively discussion.
I don't need that. I have one slide.
You only have one slide, yeah.
All right, so I'm going to try and make this quick. the big thing here is that some of this is for the community's benefit, some of this is for the ISG and the IAB's benefit, because this is a work group forming law. So part of what we're trying to do here is figure out, is there sufficient energy for work to be done in the IETF, and is there work that's applicable to the IETF to be done? So with that in mind, what I'm going to try and do is kind of cover what I think is kind of the historical basis of why we're here. There had been a variety of identity-based services and solutions that have been posited about either actually having been deployed or at least been thought through. Some of these things rely around, circle around like mobility solutions, multi-homing solutions. These all potentially have to deal with the fact that certain aspects of messages that get flown across the network get overloaded because people are looking for something that they can use to identify the source of this traffic or the destination of traffic. And they typically tend to gravitate towards things like the IP address. And so there are protocols running around that have different semantics for the IP address that cause problems because one part of the system is assuming that this is an identity, and another part assumes that this is some kind of locator information. And so some of these protocols have been designed to expressly separate these two functions together. And so what we're trying to figure out here is there a framework that can be formulated to provide these ID-based services the ability to separate identity and location from each other? And more importantly is, if we can identify a framework, is there actually sufficient energy and interest in the IETF to do that work? And so that's why I'm hoping that all of you are here, is to either tell me yes or no about that particular question. Does anybody have any clarifying questions on why we're here, or should we go ahead and get started? Okay, so I think we're going to start with the problem statement. Padma?
And these should be the very last ones you sent me, Padma.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Padma Pillai-Esno, and I'm going to present the problem statement for identity-enabled networks on behalf of my co-authors. And we have a long list of contributors that I'm going to share on the last slide. So let's talk a little bit about the motivation. Why are we here? What is IDEAS trying to do? To understand that better, we have to look at the perspective of all the actors in the network and their perspective. What do we have today? We have a network which is successful and evolving. We know that the trend is increasing access diversity as well as device diversity. We have ubiquitous mobility is a given, it's the norm today. And for the sake of discussion today, we're going to restrain ourselves to identifier location split protocols. When we look at it from the user perspective, what they really want is privacy, finer grain access control, as well as personalized context-aware features. From an operator standpoint, of course, they want to generate revenue from these kind of services, but more importantly as well, they really want to have operational and deployment simplicity. So what can we do here to help out to deliver these tasks? And one of the ways of doing this is what IDEAS is proposing, is to introduce the identity identifier split. What do I mean by that? As Brian said earlier, about 10 years ago, we came up with the concept of identifier location split. And what we're proposing today is just one step forward more, which is the identity identifier split. What do you mean by that? I'm going to have a small table here, which is a 10,000-foot view of the difference, because Bob is going to have a longer presentation on identity and a discussion on that. But two main characteristics is identity is unique to an entity, and identifiers, we might have multiple identifiers, and they're associated to that identity. The identity has a notion of secrecy. It's never shown clear on the wire, whereas the identifier can be shown as clear on the wire. You'll understand that a little bit better when I explain the different use cases. But more importantly, the identity is an enabler. It will enable us to have lookup access control, which cannot be easily defeated, protecting the privacy of your flows to eavesdroppers. If it is immutable, you can also have an external representation that can be erasable, which is very difficult to do today. And finally, we will be able to give more policies based on ID or features based on identity. Let's look at one of the problems that we see today. Privacy, who's looking for me? Okay, so here's the stuff is that for some reason the animation is not working. Yeah. Well, anyway, here's the stuff is that originally the slide showed Alice who's going around, and typically in ID location separation protocols, they will update the mapping system. And one of her friends, Mary, for example, would be actually asking the mapping system where they are. And repeatedly, but by repeatedly asking for her, she can always find where she is. That's actually great because you want your friends to find you anywhere you are. But the picture changes if it's no longer your friend, but a hacker that's actually looking for you. Number one, the fact that you have a public identifier, well, you have no control, it's public data. Anybody can look you up, anybody can track you, and you have really no privacy. And it is very difficult to defeat that. So what we see here is that we really need access control tied to the identity, not so much to identifier or IP addresses, because you can change those. And the real balance is you want a long-lived identifier for discovery, but you also want to protect your privacy. Here's another case where you have Bob talking to Alice, and we do the resolution layer, and we build the packets, IP packets. One thing that will happen is that you will eventually build your IP packet with, the semantics might be a little bit different depending on protocols, but you'll have an IP header, your ID header, and your packet. But if you have somebody actually sniffing those two planes, sniffing the packets, and they can actually look up, they will be able to identify the flows and who are the peers, who's talking to who. And I can see most likely what you're going to tell me is, hey, why don't we just encrypt the packet? But the problem is that once you encrypt the packet, the animation is not working, but it's fine. What will happen is that you'll end up with an IP packet, just a plain IP packet. At that point, it was not going to be possible to do any identity-based features anymore. And what we really want is not really to encrypt the header, but you really want them to be meaningless to eavesdroppers so that even if it's unclear, they wouldn't be able to do anything with it. The last one here is long-lived identifiers.
Use the mic when you ask a question, please.
So long-lived identifiers, can you delete them? So you really want to have those long-lived identifiers, but let's say now Bob, that used to be your friend, is no longer your friend. And how do we stop him from using that? And so you will have a lot of unwanted communication. There's nothing you can do about it. So what we do know is that identifiers that has been used before by legitimate peers can be abused eventually. And if we try to erase them from the system, then you lose all information tied to that identifier. What you really want is actually your entry in the system to be immutable because that's tied to you. But the external representation of that you share with your peers, these ones should be erasable. Earlier, I mentioned that we have a diversity of devices that's going to come. with that comes the implication that we may not have one solution fit all in the future. So what we still see as difficulties in mapping systems is that you might have multiple mapping systems, and this in itself will be an impediment for their deployment because it's going to be operationally very complex to deploy those and to maintain those. It's going to be very difficult to have common basic and consistent policies applied. The management is going to be difficult. You're going to have a disjoint view of the network. So all this makes sense that we should have a common infrastructure and primitives that actually can benefit to all these ID location protocols. Now, this is the proposal. Disclaimer here, this is not an architecture slide. It is just a slide to show where are the boundaries of where IDEAS is going to be relevant. We have this generic identity service, which have different instances, and they have different modules. You have the traditional mapping module identity identifier that we have today, identifier location that we have today. And then we're bringing the new identity services, policy-based services, or metadata module. Now, all these modules are not, some of them are optional, but the two main ones that we really want to bring first is the identity service and the mapping service. And what we're also looking at is a grid interface so that we can actually interwork with other protocols that already exist and already have their control plane. Now, the changes in the protocols would actually be to interact with this interface of grids. So in green is the area where IDEAS would have work done in a smooth way. Now, the scope of work, we're really talking about network identifiers here. The locators are assumed to be IPv4, v6. When we talk about metadata, it's not something complex, it's something very simple, it's not changing, it's very low frequency, it's not even in the data plane or anything like that. The identity services is really for registration of those services and identities. It's a very simple access control. Depending on how you want to deploy grids, you could be able to deploy it locally or on a global scope. And eventually, if we have a global scope, intergrids might be in the scope then. Out of scope, absolutely, is we're not trying to do mapping of domain names. We're not trying to do application level names or directories. That's not the point here. We're not trying to do high frequency data changes either. Nor trying to bring very complex policies on that. What's the relationship with the other working groups? HIP and LESP are major protocols that already have a control plane, and if they want to benefit from this notion of identity identifier split, we will want to collaborate with them to extend the control plane to interact with those services, with that interface that I showed earlier. MPO3 is also doing some type of mapping, and it would be interesting to discuss with them and find out whether they might benefit from such an open control plane as well. So thank you on behalf of the IDEAS design team, which is a large team. And so the work that I presented here is really the work of everyone in this list. We also have multiple companion documents that we didn't present today, but gives you more use cases both on identity and identifier. Questions?
Hi, Ravi. So I just want to understand, because normally you go from service plane to identifier. So is this goal to interconnect some thing that would do something at the service level?
No, we're talking about network identifier level, right?
Yeah.
Which is not, when you're talking about service level, you're talking about really application level data, yes, which is not the scope of what we're trying to do.
So
here.
Because you're talking about Alice talking to Bob, and so always Alice and Bob are connected to one service, and they use some human-friendly names to translate that into that's transparent to applications more or less, and those are kind of more ephemeral identifiers. He changes, the IP address changes, so those are not persistent identifiers at all. And I don't know how much security is exposed because of that. Because most of the things are in the higher application layer, like HTTP and other applications. So, what I'm trying to get at is, I mean, who would use this?
So, I would say this. Today, we're talking about applications. There are some applications that actually, I can see you're looking at it from that level only, but on the slides, it was written ID aware. So we're really thinking about applications that are ID aware and using an underlay, using Lisp or HEP or other protocols. So it doesn't necessarily mean that these are service level applications. And if this was the case, most probably there are ways of doing this, but this is not really what we're after.
So I mean, what I'm missing is a good use case in that slide, and I couldn't find one. So who is using this and what is the application of this mapping system is not clear.
Okay, let me ask this question to you. If you had the possibility of preventing unwanted traffic, would you use it?
That's what I'm understanding, trying to understand. You didn't put a use case for that.
So my question is that to you. Would you use it if you had the ability to find control unwanted traffic?
Unwanted traffic in the sense of what?
That you don't want people to look you up and find out where you are.
That's what I said. Those are mostly at the service level. You have policies to do it. So if I on WhatsApp, I probably say, okay, I don't want, there's a blacklist. I don't want users to find me, and they won't find me.
Oh,
so that's why I said it seems to be more a service-related problem, right?
There are a couple of use cases listed in the use case document. There are 4 use cases. One is the primary use case is mobility. Wherever mobility is needed, it enhances the security of the mobility services provided by the ID location protocols. That is one use case. And there are 3 more use cases listing in the IoT use cases with the local grids instance and low power and high power devices and IoT cases. And there are 2 more use cases. It's all detailed in the grids IDEAS use case document.
Yeah. Okay. So, no, what I'm trying to get at is you're not touching the forwarding plane where you have some naming, and even I don't see why ICN is not a candidate here. Even you can include ICN too, but you're building something on top of it.
So,
right? So you are basically trying to say that I have a name and then I want to get another identifier, which is on the wire, right?
So I think you asked me the same question last time, and my answer to you was,
to me. So
I think we actually asked me the same question. I think it was on Sunday. Yeah. So my answer stays the same to you, is that ICN is about data, and here we're talking about communication endpoints, right?
ICN is not just about data. ICN is about naming, ICN is about security, ICN is about completely
I
new
think
network
this is
layer,
probably better as sort of in the next steps, like down at the end. But I see where he's going, and I have some agreement with him. But I think there's like sort of a bigger discussion sort of at the end there. So,
just real quickly, Bob Moskowitz, it's a matter of scaling, which we're going to get into in the discussions as we proceed.
Okay.
That's Sakimura Nomura Research. So thank you for your presentation. The terminology that you use, the identity, is completely different from what the identity and access management community is using. So I guess there should be some kind of alignment, at least. In our world, in the identity and access management community, the entity and identity actually have one-to-N relationship. Mm-hmm. And identity is usually defined as a set of attributes or set claims related to an entity, right? And then identifier is something that the combination of the attributes which uniquely identify that entity in the group of entities, right?
So it really depends on how you want to define it. And actually, this is an interesting one, because we actually have been discussing about in the charter to actually define what an identity for IETF means. And this is actually what Bob's next presentation is going to be about. But just to answer you, is that the way we see an identity is a representation of who, what you're saying uniquely identifies you. And the way we're looking at it is that the identifier and the locator is showing where you are. So it really depends on how you want to define it. And I think it's better to wait for Bob's presentation to actually have that discussion.
Yeah, but my point is that if you align the terminologies with, for example, IAM's community, then you'll probably be able to leverage some of their works as well. So I
really would defer that to Bob, because Bob will have very specifically talking about IAM.
It's George Karagiannis here. Is it possible to wait with the questions until the end? Because many questions are actually being placed on things that will be presented. So can we wait with questions until the end?
Well, I think some of these more detailed ones will wait to where we have the more open discussion sort of thing, where we can sort of listen to all the stuff and then hear what's going on. But yes. So.
Okay, Luigi. I have one question. Is on slide 8.
Okay.
You show at some point there is. If you go down in your scheme, you go down to the control plane, and then you have a bunch of different protocols, encapsulation on them. Yeah. Any thought about how you choose them? Or maybe there is a presentation later on this issue. I don't know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it was another presentation. I know what diagram you have. But.
Okay, and if you go to slide 11, so as a LISP working group co-chair, I have to point out that in our charter there is one item that is a mapping system that supports multiple encapsulation. So just to bring this up, we have to be a little bit careful how we move forward, but that's it. Obviously, collaboration open. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, definitely.
Wolfgang Riedel. I'm a little bit concerned about the out-of-scope things. It's like we're living in a world where EID space gets shared. So you see like a typical hosting company shares maybe hundreds of applications behind a single EID. On the other hand, we're seeing HTTP2 getting more and more traction. So everything is encrypted end-to-end anyway, and the EID itself is meaningless. So we have to think about a different way to identify application to ensure that you can really have end-to-end security. So a pure EID will not good enough, I guess. So this is why I'm a little bit concerned. So maybe we should widen the out-of-scope thing a little bit to go closer to an application.
Yeah. So actually, I think we need to discuss, because obviously, this is the first time we're discussing about this. But if you have other ways of doing things, we welcome people to actually work with us and actually do that. Definitely. Okay.
Robin Wilton, I had 2 comments. But one of them is about taxonomy, so I'll defer that to see if it's covered in the later presentations. The second one was to do with the layers that you've been describing. And it was just to point out that whether you're talking about the network layer, the device layer, the application layer, the human layer, there are identifiers present at all of those layers.
Absolutely.
And from a human identity and privacy perspective, the point is that you must be conscious that an individual can be identified by means of data at any of those layers. So, for example, consistent use of the same MAC address might identify an individual. So it's simply that it is useful to have that layered approach. In fact, it's probably necessary to have it, but not to assume that identity of an individual is resident at any particular one of them.
Absolutely, and we agree with you, and this is not really here. It's interesting you asked this question, because I think Bob is going to have the presentation where they talk a little bit more about identity and what we mean by identity. And I think that will actually help also some of the discussions that's happening here where they get, so let's have Bob's presentation first, and then we'll have a better idea.
I just had we had one question sort of as the chairs, in sort of looking at the control plane stuff. The curiosity, how many folks here, their company deploy like Lisp, for example, in their network in production? Oh, okay. It looks like maybe a half dozen. Okay. And is anybody looking to, because I wonder, as you talk about that, I guess that's a concern if you're sort of working on leveraging stuff that maybe people aren't going to deploy. So, that, the chicken and egg problem, right? So I wonder how people are sort of.
Can you ask the same for HIP and ILA?
What?
Can you ask the same question for HIP and ILA?
Oh, yes. That was the next question I was going to say. Yeah. Sorry. And your name? Okay, thank you. So how many folks here are deploying HIP in their network today? They're not here. Okay, so that's fine. We can, Bob will speak for them.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I can
mobile IP.
I can say the same thing about ILA.
Okay.
They have large deployments of Facebook, but they're not here.
And his comment about the sort of service, I think, like the open source people would have solved this with a bunch of APIs, with some sort of, wacky software sort of thing, right? And so I think that would be a question that would probably come out later down the road, is like, why one versus two kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just saying, this is how probably another group of people would have solved it, right? Yeah. So I know I went and asked, I work at an enterprise company, at Salesforce. We make this kind of strange product that some people seem to love. But I went and talked to all the network engineers because they took all my access away years ago. But they're the idea of deploying Lisp in the network sort of scares them. And so they're like big BGP people, but it's like, and so they're they've gotten much more used to sort of saying, oh, we'll just write a bunch of software with a bunch of APIs. They feel more comfortable with that now, which of course 5 years ago they would have been totally freaked out by that. So it's interesting sort of seeing that shift in sort of the networking folks.
Yeah, and about the usefulness, I just want to say something else. We have a few proponents who are not here today. For example, there are some of them who actually work in the IoT, for example, and IoT for them, they really want to have a discovery service, and they want this. So it's true that we may not have everybody here who is representative of.
Yeah. So, but when I was listening to his thing, it sort of resonated a little bit. Yeah. It was about service discovery and stuff. So it's just stuff for later on in the conversation. Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Bob, it's your turn. Is it hit first? No.
Hello, I'm Bob Moskowitz. I'm not the Bob that Padma had in her slides. The other Bob.
Bob number 2.
As that is the starting point of identity and identifiers, and why the distinction, and what is the benefit. So I just click here. The arrows. There we go. So I only have 2 slides here. And these slides are for the thought process and what the discussion is going to be in the working group. The point I want to talk about here is there's a lot about identity. Here I'm talking about identity within the framework of the IETF, and particularly in the framework of what we're talking about, identity-oriented networking. So define identity for ideas. IETF endpoint identity is unique to the entity. And the other key thing here is we're not talking about identity of people. We're talking about identity of machines. That's one of the important points here. Don't bring up discussions about people. Yes, there's a lot of talk about your cell phone is yours personally, so your personal identity and your cell phone are tied together. But how many of you have like 3 or 4 cell phones? We're talking here about identity is unique to an identity is unique to an entity meaning a machine, a silicon creature. Here an entity is limited to the machine, not an organic entity. But also to allow for ephemeral anonymous identity for privacy use. This is a fun discussion. Is there only one identity for an entity, or are there multiple? Have they lifetimes? Those sorts of discussions, great discussions. I don't want to do those discussions here in this BOF, but be aware that we are having those discussions, and they are appropriate within the work group, because that will influence aspects of the grids. But another point about this concept of identity, they need to be shared and understood. We need to be able to talk about identity. So they need to be expressed in some language. And is that language a fully qualified domain name? Is it an X500 name inside of an X509 certificate? Is it NAI? The answer to that is yes. We need to support different languages in which to discuss identity. And so when we talk about this, we can't limit ourselves to one language of identity. We need to support multiple languages of identity so that whatever community, and this is the scalability point, we need something that's scalable and flexible and not limited to one domain of interpretation. And define identifier for ideas. So what we have come up right now, and this is again going to be an area of discussion and debate, but putting a stake in the ground. And for those of you who don't know the origin of the US expression stake in the ground, I'll explain that to you later. There's an interesting, rather bloody explanation for that. IETF endpoint identifier is a valid but typically non-routable IPv6 address or an IPv4 address. It could be a portion of a routable address, so it could be the end part of an IPv6 address. We have a lot of fun in this areas. It may be statistically unique or maybe some sort of a managed space, but it really must be managed within a domain of use so you don't have collisions. Even because with HIP, we've done a lot with the statistically unique, and we've done a lot with being able to avoid collisions. So we have a lot of history and experience about, well, you either have to have a big space or you really got to manage it. You pretty got to manage it. The restriction of the endpoint identity to IP addresses is to be transparent to the applications and management of the local EID mapping. Another key operational protocol point. And HIP and Lisp achieve this. And others could achieve it, probably may achieve it as well. There may be shorthands for identifiers within specific applications, because if your endpoint identity is a v6 address, and you have to carry that in every packet as well as the loc, you get these big packets that the IoT people complain and scream about. So we have shorthands. In HIP, they are called security parameter indices, which are just 4 bytes, 32 bits. So you may have a shorthand in which you actually operationally use, which is distinguished from the actual identifier, which is then used in the negotiation protocols and the rest of it. These two slides is what we have discussed a lot over the last 20 years. I can go back even to earlier discussions if I want to, if you want to corner me on that. We've been talking about this for a long time. The problem we have had is we have not built the infrastructure for discovery, how to discover your partner, how to discover what services are available, how to do the reverse. If you have an identifier, what identity is that for? And are you allowed to know what policies are in place to constrain that discovery? This is not about the actionability. This is not about how local EID works. HIP and Lisp and ILA address that. This is how we get from the what it is I want to talk to, what is identity of that, then what's the identifier so that I can find them in the network, and if I'm permitted to work with them in the network. So those are my two slides, which are for discussion points. I will now open briefly discussions, but know that most of the discussion we want to take to the main list. Yes.
Okay. If you go back to the previous slide, okay, you mentioned NAI. We have been here in IETF before about to explore the meaning of identity, okay? It's not new.
No.
Okay. Now, we, especially I remember in EAP working group, EAP, even AAA, when we talked about NAI, we said, yeah, NAI has to have a user identity and also the realm. So there are two pieces. We didn't even care about IPv4 or IPv6 address. Now, I think identity, the scope of identity is not really that simple. So we need to look into like a billable identity that you can use that. Like today, you have a service. For your cell phone, you have a service, not the person that owns the phone. So that is like your IMSI, which is a service-related identity, which is globally unique, by the way. Then you have an identity for the device itself, the shell. So that is your IMEI, which is the equipment identity. Then you have an NAI, which basically takes you and maps those identities into a service that is consumable by the network, okay? Which is mainly NAI, and that NAI now is well positioned in IETF and is widely used, okay? So I'm new to ideas, but I'm trying to explore or relate or link the ideas into what we know so far about identity that I mentioned, examples, IMEI, IMSI, and then we have NAI, and of course we have the IP address, but I don't think that IP address is that relevant to this.
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's identifier and loc.
Okay. So those are the good examples, and we need to really focus on the scope of this new working group and to see which problem this working group is aimed to solve. Which problem? Is that the billing problem? Is the routing problem? Is that authentication problem? Is that authorization problem? Is something else?
Billing to me is metadata. So if that identity has billing characteristics, that would be part of metadata, which would get into the policy of access and the rest of that. And those people who live with those sorts of identities, as they add their piece of this into what we do, they'll provide that metadata and how it works, and then what the policies are used to this. Notice I say EG. These are examples. It is not meant to be an exhaustive list, or maybe even a proper list. Maybe NAI doesn't belong here. I'm not going to say yes or no. In fact, I was told to add NAI. I did not have it in the first version of my slides. So that's the point there. So let's take this discussion to the list. We are really open to this, but we want to create an environment where we are not constrained to one particular domain's concept of identity. We want these various domains to be able to work and gain access to the identifier loc capability.
Wolfgang Riedel again. Just to add to what's already said, I think nowadays, I, as a consumer, I don't care about the endpoint identifier described here. I care about the application I'm talking to. And I think the security guys have done a good work with thinking about Snort database, whatever, to already generate identifiers for application. Maybe it makes sense to replace the endpoint identifier by somehow an identifier already being used in the security environment to identify applications and replace this one. So I think in a world where we are living in virtualization and content distribution networks, an IP prefix doesn't really give you anything.
Yes, that we'll have that discussion, and we have the ability to talk about that. The aspect of service to get to the application beyond just the location of the device, that all ties in, and I'm very cognizant of that issue and some of the things dealing with. We welcome these discussions and how we include that as well. Wrap up question, one more, and then we'll move on to my next set of slides.
Misha Spiegelmach, stupid question. What about using just a public key as the identifier? Because it solves the problem of being able to create a new identity as desired. Application developers understand this concept. It's very simple. It doesn't require a lot of new infrastructure. You can have one identity for everything, like log into every website with just your public key, or you can make a new identity or identifier as desired for privacy if you need to retire one or separate your identities.
Please read the HIP architecture RFC. Okay. We did this some time ago. One of the challenges with a public key for identifiers, which public key format, and their size and other shapes. One of the major things that HIP, which I'll get in shortly, is to have a consistent representation of the identifier, regardless of the particular underlying crypto algorithm. So you can say, oh, let's just use a public key. And I say back, which one? Which public key size? Which algorithm? Which representation?
Open SSH key format.
That's just one.
Thank you.
But then you go to the key ID, which is a particular format. Okay, great segue. Thank you very much. A lot of people here are familiar with Lisp. Some people are familiar with HIP. I'm going to say as a HIP backgrounder, what really is the host identity protocol? And I'm partially to blame for where HIP has been pigeonholed in terms of where it could have been. The host identity protocol based on a new flat namespace, the host identity tag, which is a valid non-routable IPv6 address. We are assigned by IANA an IPv6 prefix. This is a valid address. Can't route it, but it's a valid address. And the HIT, host identity tag, is cryptographically derived from the host identity. So it's a raw public key in a defined format. Is it RSA? Is it DSA? Is it ECC? Which ECC? The rest of that. So that's defined to come up with a consistent representation of this format, which is the HIT. And the protocol is a minimalistic Sigma compliant, for those not in security, that means signed and MAC'd protocol. Hugo Krausik identified some wonderful attacks against Diffie-Hellman back in 1996 and defined Sigma at that time. And I was the first to do Sigma, and like V2 is Sigma. There are a couple others now which are Sigma as well. It was a Sigma compliant protocol to exchange the identity identifier plus other information between peers. And as I mentioned earlier, the SPI is the 4-byte security parameter index as a per packet identifier. And the idea here is to go to a consistent format, but the intent of HIP is identity exchange and identifier recognition between peers. And so the protocol is a very straightforward 4-packet protocol which deals with all sorts of attack vectors. And when you get into this, and some of the discussions that we've had in terms of privacy and the other things, oh boy, have we had these discussions in depth. So the I1 trigger exchange is basically, I want to talk to you. There's no crypto in it at all. So there's no initial demand attack against the responder. Extensive discussions, but even here we have found in IoT some reflective attacks in IoT against the responder. The important thing here is that the responder's host identity is sent in the clear because we don't have any keys yet to protect it. And again, that's to address a resource exhaustion attack. Then the I2 response, by this point you have a key, and then the R2 acknowledgement. And in the header, there's the HIT, both initiator, responder, and everyone. The point here is this is a very lightweight protocol for exchanging identifier and the underlying identity in the exchange and establish the relationship between them with a lot of concern in a very simple state machine that either party can be the initiator. You can switch roles. You can cover from loss of state to a number of other related things. My first professor in college was death on state machines. You didn't do the state machine, you got a 0. So I did the state machine for this. HIP mobility is a concept of a rendezvous service. As I think it was Steve Deering who told me that, Bob, you have to be able to meet when you both move. So how do you meet your rendezvous? So that's the origin of the rendezvous server. I can thank Steve Deering for getting me on that path. Peer registers to an RVS using the HIP registration protocol. The peer publishes its RVS address as its location. The initiator sends the I1 to the RVS as a result, because it doesn't know where where it wants to go to, but the RVS does. And the RVS forwards the I1 to the peer, and the peer then sends R1 directly to the initiator. And so we talk about is a slingshot operation. The RVS slingshots the I1 to the peer and has no further interaction. So the RVS is a very low communications overhead requirements because you register to it and it sends forward until the peer moves. When a peer moves, it sends a HIP notify, HIP update with the new location, both to its peers, in case the peers have moved, and to the RVS, so that the RVS now knows where the peer is. So you can tell your peer, hello, I just moved over here, I just moved over here, and your peer can do the same to you. But what happens if you both move at the same time? How do you handle the double jump? So in the double jump, when you send to your peer, he's no longer there to receive it. He's gone. So that's where the RVS, you can relearn via the RVS. We've accelerated this in my new HIP fast mobility draft using what's called a shotgun approach to be able to, in some cases, to go to 1 or even 0 round trips for the mobility operation. So HIP well handles the identity and the move operation, but you got to use it for something. It's a lot of fun to be able to identify a partner and to know where that partner is, but what do you do with it? And so the main thing that HIP has been used for, where most people think about it, is to enable peer-to-peer tunneling of HIP-based connections using the SPI. And so we have HIP-based ESP in bound-to-bound and transport. We call that beat mode, or beat. And there is I have a draft on a session layer application of HIP. And there's also a draft on a HIP in IP, which is variants of IP and IP, which is non-secure, but again, does this. I'll also say that in 802.15, there is a key management pathway to use HIP for IPv, for 802.15.4 devices for their key establishment. So HIP should not be about simpler ESP, but about connecting to endpoints. But there were weaknesses here. Too much crypto. People have always complained that HIP has too much crypto in it. And that's one of the justifications why Shim 6 was done back in the day. We want something with less crypto. One of the answers I've done, this is the HIP diet exchange, where I do lose Sigma compliance and a few other things, but it's the minimal cryptographic operations. And this new HIP in IP tunnel, which does not record, which give up the crypto and protection of the packet if you assume that your network is safe to run such a thing over. The other complaint is a change in IP stack behavior, that you have to implement in the stack the HIP to LOC mapping. And that means an actual change to the endpoint where there's been resistance against that. Others have considered that a good thing, so it depends on which side of the argument you stand on. And probably the biggest thing and why I'm here today is HIT discovery. We have DNS resource record for FQDN to go from a high, to get a high in a HIT, but that's the only real thing we have there. And we did an experiment with distributed hash tables to do a reverse lookup to given a HIT, how you can get back to the FQDN to go back to DNS and all around. And we've never really well addressed inside of HIP what is being discussed here in IDEAS. So this could be one of the big enablers to able to get the HIP more usable than it is today. So new work in HIP, other than working with IDEAS, there's hierarchical hits, which will actually also play in to better work with IDEAS. There's a fast mobility, so that we can even go faster than we were before. And there is new, faster crypto, and stay tuned for even newer, faster crypto that I'll be working on as well. So people who complain about the crypto, we're really working on that. That's what I have. It's an introduction to HIP. So you can see that in terms of what we, and again, we're talking about here of identifier LOC separation and identity to identifier use. And then why we need IDEAS, because there are things that have not been well done, and the discovery is a very, very important piece. So that's all I have on HIP, and if you have any questions, I'll answer them, or we can take it to the list. And I gave this as a reference presentation.
So I'm going to limit the question just to important clarifying questions on HIP since we're already running behind.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Albert?
Hello, so I'm going to present the gap analysis for identity-enabled networks. So although Brian did a very nice historical and technical contextualization, I would like to complement it, give a little bit of background. So it is very well known that IP addresses have overloaded semantics, meaning that IP addresses both identify who the node is and where it is attached to. This, at least this is the oldest reference we could find, is well documented in IETF back in '93. And a well-known solution for this is to use the ID locator split paradigm, which means that we create two different namespaces. One namespace will be used to identify who the node is, and the other one where the node is attached to. So what happened is that over the years, we have seen several solutions which have been developed following this paradigm. For instance, HIP and the locator ID separation protocol. Now, what those solutions have in common is that they create an infrastructure where you store the mappings between the who and the where you store the mappings between both namespaces. So in Lisp, it's called mapping system, and it's the rendezvous server in HIP. So now, complementing what Robert did, I will very briefly introduce how Lisp works, just in case someone is not really familiar. So in Lisp, we create two namespaces following the locator ID split paradigm. We have EIDs, which identify end hosts, and then we have routing locators, which are related to the topological location of such hosts. Then the routers that connect both namespaces, they are called tunnel routers. So what happens in a Lisp packet exchange is that first the host A retrieves the EID of host B with an external mechanism, can be, for instance, DNS, and then it sends a packet, just as in a standard IP, towards host B. Then this packet is intercepted by tunnel router X, which what we will do is it has to map where this node is. So it will use the Lisp mapping system, which is this infrastructure that stores mapping between who and where, and it will query the infrastructure asking, okay, where I can find the EID for host B, which is B. Well, the answer is in Y, in locator Y. So what it will do, it will encapsulate the packet and send it towards router Y. So in the packet will go encapsulated. The outer header will be the airlocks, source airlock router X, destination airlock router Y. Inner packet will be the original packet, source EID host A, source destination EID host B. The packet will reach router I, which will decapsulate the packet and send it finally to host B. So this is pretty much how an ultra brief introduction on Lisp. So Robert already did a nice introduction on HIP, so I'm going now to focus onto the gap analysis. So this slide is trying to show conceptually what these ID log protocols have in common. What they have in common is that we have an identifier to locator infrastructure, which is used both for nodes to publish their mappings and for other hosts to retrieve the mappings. Okay, so this is conceptual, so I'm not going into the details, but we more or less can agree that this is what happens typically when we follow this paradigm. Now, regarding the gap analysis, here I'm going to present some of the gaps that we have identified. I'm going to focus on the ones that we believe are more relevant, and also the ones that are easier to explain in a 10-minute presentation. But I would like to refer all of you to the documents where you have a more detailed analysis. So, as Padma was saying, one of the issues that we have, or something that can happen when we follow this kind of paradigm, is that a mobile node, whenever it is moving, for each handover, it will obtain a new locator, which will publish into this infrastructure, which means that it is somehow easy for an attacker to track the location of this mobile node, just by querying this infrastructure, okay? You don't actually need to exchange any packet, you just have to query the infrastructure, and you will be able to track the location of this mobile node. So this, of course, raises privacy concerns. Now, the solution that we're proposing is to define policies. So users should be able to define policies which are stored into this IDEAS infrastructure that will be enforced. Now, the policies are related to, I want to control how this mapping information is disclosed, and who can query it and who cannot query it. So in this very simple example, the host on the left, they can define an access policy, which can be as simple as I want to be reached only by people in my whitelist. This is just an example. You will store this policy into the IDEAS infrastructure, which will then enforce it. Now, what will happen is that attackers won't be able to track you if this policy is enforced, while legitimate users will be able to obtain the information for packet exchange. So the gap that we have identified is that existing protocols typically assume that identifier to location information is public, and what IDEAS introduce is the notion of privacy regarding this information. So privacy means fine-grained access policies to enable custom disclosure of identity, identifier, and locator information. We are not speaking about system-wide policies, but user-defined, fine-grained access policies regarding this information. Then this access policy has to be tied to identity. I will speak about this a little bit later. And this identity is understood as something which is unique per entity. So now let's introduce the concept of identity, which is central to IDEAS. So why we need to introduce the concept of identity? There are many reasons, but one of the reasons, or an easy way to understand it is this one, although there are other reasons, is that it is very easy. If I want to prevent tracking, what I can do is I can use ephemeral identifiers, right? So I can use ephemeral identifiers and I can throw them away. So tracking becomes way harder. The problem if you use always ephemeral identifiers is that legitimate users won't be able to reach you. You need some sort of permanent identifier. And this is one of the roles of the identity. So identity, it is expected to be permanent. This is still under debate. And I will say that at least it has to be understood as something which is very long-lived, okay? Then, if the identity is long-lived, we can have ephemeral identifiers. So, in this case, a host can publish the identity to identifier, identifier to locator, mappings, and an access policy, and then use ephemeral identifiers for communication with other hosts. This can help prevent tracking, and also can help prevent that other people or people that are monitoring the network can see to whom I'm talking to, and so on. So the gap that we have identified is that, well, identifier locator protocols, they rely on identifier locators, while IDEAS introduces this notion of identity, which is unique per entity. It should be permanent or at least very long-lived, and it should be tied to the policies that we were discussing before, and never be revealed over the wire. The identifier can be understood then from a different perspective. You can see it, and this is an analogy, so this is just an analogy, but you can understand it as a session ID, which means that can be ephemeral and can be transmitted over the wire in clear, because it should not be revealed, it should not be tied to any, it should prevent disclosing any private information regarding the identity. While finally, the locator pretty much identifies, it has exactly the same meaning as in the ID lock split paradigm. So the third gap that we have identified is that, I'm sorry, there is a mistake. ILA should be on the data plane. But the third gap that we have identified is that when you have multiple ID lock split paradigms, each one is defining its own infrastructure, right? So here the idea is to develop a common infrastructure to support consistent policies and so on. So the gap is that the existing protocols offer their own mapping service for identifier to locator, and IDEAS introduces this common infrastructure for identity to identifier and identifier to locator mappings, working always with existing protocols. So to offer consistent policies and to, is network management. So this is the last slide, which is a very short summary of the three gaps that we have identified. So first, we introduce the notion of identity, which has its own life cycle, which is different to identifiers and requirements. We have strong requirements in terms of privacy, which are tied to the identity and should be understood as user-defined and fine-grained access control policies, and finally, this common infrastructure. So, questions?
Microphone.
I guess if you're talking about identity in a fixed network, maybe the scope of the problem is simpler, and you can attack it and solve the problem much easier than when you're in a mobile scenario, you have the visitor network, the home network, and the intermediate network that are basically delegating some of the functions between the two. Like you have seen the IP sphere and the GRX. And so what is the scope of ideas here? Is this mobility brings a new dimension to this problem?
So, no, I presented the gap analysis and the gaps. So the scope is to introduce this privacy, identity, and common infrastructure. So that's the scope of the forming working group.
Bob Moskowitz, mobility is fully handled. Mobility and multi-homing, multi-pathing, all that is capable, and that ties in how the identifier then works. Identity is there, depending on which domain you're working in. I have no problem with it. I know how to use it for it. And even on all sorts of different networks.
So with all due respect, I partially disagree with that. But that's just, we take it to the mailing list or?
Sure, thank you.
Torles, go ahead.
Yeah, I would appreciate if the chairs could ask the two questions: who has read the problem statement, who has read the use case draft.
You've got the mic. So, okay. So we're fighting over that. Let's start with the problem statement draft because that was the first one. And some of this we were sort of waiting until we got to the end of all the things. Sort of show of hands, who's read the problem statement draft? Okay, good group of people. Okay, who's read the sort of the gap analysis draft? Okay, very similar sort of group of people. Okay, that's kind of what I was thinking. Okay, good.
Just a comment.
Yep.
Do we have some time for?
State your name.
George Garjanis, Huawei. Do you have some time to discuss the charter? Because I think it's important.
So we have about 24 minutes left in this session. What I'm going to do is I'm going to allow for an open discussion up until about 10 minutes. And then I've got some questions. And if those questions are answered the way I think they're going to be answered, then we may go over what may be parts of the charter. But I want to make sure that everybody understands the problem statement and the gap analysis so that we have a coherent conversation about whether or not there is work here for the IETF to be done.
Okay, because the charter is actually maybe emphasizing more directly what the working group will do. So maybe we can have a short look into the charter first.
May I? So taking a quick read of the charter, I will say this simply, it's way too dense and you should go and probably take 3/4 of it out. Just from experience and getting sort of groups chartered, you want something very lightweight and very flexible that you can build stuff around. And a lot of that can be sort of done on the list as well. So that's just my opinion, having, you know, sort of spun up working groups in this, and the AD seemed much more agreeable to sort of spinning up a working group with a very lightweight charter that can be, you know, flexible, give you some space. And you guys are really trying to be very specific about stuff, which is great. You're thinking about stuff, but, you know, give yourself some room in case you get to go down the road and you realize, oh, we have to go backwards and do something else, right?
Jim Guichard, I just wanted the chairs to ask the same question for the use case document as well, because there's a bunch of questions that have been asked that if you've read the use case document, the answer's right there.
Okay.
So, you know, read that document.
Because that one, I know we weren't going to talk about here, and we weren't sure if that thing was really going to move forward. So how about a show of hands on the use case document? So I'd say about half of what was from who'd read the problem statement and gap analysis. Does that seem about right? Yeah. Okay.
So what I want to do is kind of start this open mic session with this first question, and I'd like people to, you know, explain why they think it's well defined or why they don't think it's well defined.
Fabio Maino. So just make an observation. Listening at Albert's presentation on the gap analysis and looking at Padma's slides, especially the one that was trying to define what are the work items of the working groups. I think there is a bit of a disconnect. From Albert's presentation, the takeaway is that the focus is on the meta protocol that is between existing mapping system and a higher level mapping system that provides the service of separation between identity and identifier. And that is what I take away from Albert's presentation, right? Is okay, there is a service where given an ID separation protocol, whatever it is, there is a way that if we have concern about privacy, about access control to the mapping, I can use this protocol, the IDEA protocol, to basically do that mapping. When I look, I think slide 8 is the one that I think also Luigi was referring to. In that slide, there are various pieces of work that are suggested, and some pieces are at the meta level between the first level mapping protocols and the higher level mapping protocol, but some pieces are also between other data planes, the light green arrows there between, for example, other and ILA, those refer to control plane that is a mapping protocol like Ietf or like Lisp. So I think one aspect to consider for the charter is are those green arrows in scope, and probably connecting to what Luigi was saying, Lisp has some of that work in its own charter, so there may be some coordination there.
So I just want to have a clarification here. Lisp and HIP have a control plane.
Right.
Some protocols like ILA do not have a control plane today. So as you can see, on purpose, it's not a dark green, it's a light green, right, because these are still things that need to be discussed. We're not saying that it has to be there, but as nothing exists, there might be other things coming out. Do we want to do that or not, whether in scope or not? This is still up in the air. I think that this is further down the road and we don't want to go there right now.
Right. And the other aspect related to that is the data plane, right? And I think ILA as well, I think there isn't a place where those data planes are defined. So that is something that also the charter will have to decide if it is in scope or not.
Absolutely.
Hi, I'm Dirk Kutscher. So as far as I understand this, you are saying today we have different services, applications that all use some or could benefit from some kind of identifier mapping. So for name solution, for finding locators and so on. So there could be a benefit in defining a generic identity service. And if you do that, you could also have this additional privacy feature and, for example, have policies that can control unwanted communication, for example. So now, I mean, so in the internet today, I mean, we have a couple of these systems. So we have like voice over IP with SIP, I have my IM service. Today, I kind of maintain the mappings to all of them kind of individually. So it's a decentralized system. Okay, we could say that there's quite some overhead. On the other hand, so I cannot actually decide for myself how much do I trust my DNS resolver, my IM server, my SIP server. If I end up in a, say, more generic, potentially more universal system, would you also see the risk of, I mean, so for some people, unwanted communication is free speech. So do you see the problem that there could be some, you know, it's really big universal system that can also be abused? So you're kind of centralizing many of the services.
Bob Moskowitz, that is definitely one of the use cases we want to handle. We want to have it so that devices, I'm looking for Padma and I want to talk voice to her. And they say, well, you're not in her list of friends, go away or get connected. So it's that sort of discovering how to do it maybe beyond our ability, or we may be able to achieve it. So that's going to take it to the list, because that is really one of the things that we would like to say. Here is the SIP phone discovery service. Here is this one. Here's that one. Can we find a way to somewhat more map them together? Or maybe it's too big. We don't know. Let's give it a go.
My name is Uma. I just want to add, Bob, what he said, like, the SIP mapping system you talked about and IAM, that's completely in different domain, right? It's like IAM is completely in application domain. That's not what we're talking about. This is for network layer separation from identifier for further abstraction. It's not application level.
Okay. So Yari, you're standing back there. I figure you're standing back there just to tell me I was wrong, quietly. So.
Yeah. So I actually had one comment and one question, not related to this previous exchange. Do you want me to go ahead? Okay. So the comment is that I actually don't really have an opinion about this particular proposed work, other than that it's probably related to the need and desire to do the ID locator split work in general. So that probably should be a guidance for us. But the question I had, and kind of like a worry, I was listening to this, and you guys talked about identity and identifier. At least some of the presentations or presenters said identity is a permanent thing. And it could be that it's just a sort of philosophical difference or construct, and I have no reason to worry, but I certainly wouldn't like to see a situation where sort of like I'm let's say a hip host or user, and I would have some infrastructure that I have to have an identity relationship with, and then when I change my identifier, add more identifiers, I'd have to be somehow interacting with that infrastructure. I don't want that. That would be a horrible thing from a privacy and tracking perspective. I just wanted to sort of ask if that was what people were thinking or not.
It's being thought extensively, and in the design group, we have spent hours on this point already. And we know, and I know we have to accommodate, I think most of us do as well. So yes, we talk about identity as being permanent, but which identity is permanent, which ones are not, and our identity is really permanent. There's different opinions on this, and I don't think there's one answer.
So are you confirming my worry?
Yes.
Thank you.
We're going to address it. Be worried, but we are working on it.
So Yari, one other answer to that. In Albert's summary slide, he did say that the identity had its own life cycle. He didn't give a value for that life cycle. So I think I see a lot of questions as to what it's going to look like.
This is not an 802.1ar certificate, which is said to be permanent and immutable for the life of the device. We're not talking about being limited in that way.
Okay. All right. So given the time, what I want to do is I want to get a concrete sense of the room here about this first question. So I'm going to do a hum on whether or not people think this problem is well defined. If you think this problem is well defined, hum now. All right, if you don't think this problem is well defined, hum now. You guys are as bad as the TLS working group. All right.
Dave Oran, I was reluctant to ask this question because I haven't read the docs. I was asking somebody who worked on the docs whether this was in here. Did the people working on this look at APIP and reject it as out of scope because it's not a locator separator, locator ID separation protocol?
Yes, no.
APIP? Dave Naylor?
I'm looking at them right now, and they're
2013.
shaking their head.
So here's the stuff, is that it really depends
It's a
on
SIGCOMM paper.
how large we want to make the scope or not, and this is one of the reasons why we restricted the scope to identifier locator protocols here. But but this is something that we can discuss. But originally, we really wanted to restrict it.
Whether you put it in scope, anybody working on this problem should read that paper, because it nails the entire problem statement in one swoop.
So Dave, I'm going to keep you on the spot for just a second, and you can answer with a head nod or not. So in general, are you asking if the design team has basically done like a literature review on what exists now and what?
That's one way to put it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine if you say the scope is getting identity to work with locator ID separation protocols. That's the entire scope. Fine. But you know, there's other approaches to this identity problem that, for host and network layer. Should I accept this packet? Should someone be able, should someone be able to vouch for this packet? Sort of things that, you at least people ought to understand what's been done.
I was there at that time. I remember those discussions. So yes, the people who were starting this out did not necessarily do, but we didn't do it. So why did we do it?
Well, it's perfectly okay if the scope is actually locator ID separation protocols. But you'll learn a lot by looking at that paper. Just giving you a recommendation.
Yes.
That you'll learn a lot.
It was fun.
I know one of the things that not really concerned, but I think about is, I know the design team's been working really hard on this and they've been doing this, but there is a little bit lack of transparency in sort of what's going on there, because it's not sort of feeding back into the list as much. And so I think a lot of the questions that come up are things that you guys probably have discussed and maybe sort of solved, but it's not been sort of, propagated out through folks. And so that's just my, hey, let's make sure that we're not sort of, leaving people off sort of thing, right? Yes, it's sometimes easier to do that because then you can sort of focus on stuff, and sometimes you get pulled away into things. But I think some of these you guys probably have already looked at and sort of thought about and sort of, yes. So just to give it some, friendly suggestion sort of thing. So.
Okay, so just to get a complete view of this, I'm going to go with the second question here and do a hum on whether or not people think there's work for the IETF to do. So if you think there's something here for the IETF to work on, hum now. And if you don't think there's something here for the IETF to do, hum now.
Oh, that is TLS.
To my ears, that was definitely more of a favor of there is work here for the IETF to do. So now I'm going to put people on the spot. If there was a working group formed and there's work to be done, such as writing drafts and reviewing drafts, raise your hand if you're going to contribute to it.
Just on the previous one, before you move on, Cullen Jennings here. I think that when a lot of people...
Name, sorry.
Cullen Jennings, as I just said. Yep.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I think that a lot of us, when we think the work is somewhat undefined, and if you had asked the original question as, do you think the problem in the charter statement as written is well defined, I think you would have gotten an even less ambiguous hum. I think when we don't know what the work is, it's really hard to answer the question, is there work for the IETF to do here? So I wouldn't read too much into that second hum, given the results of the first hum.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, mute echo is queued.
Oh. Thank you. Oh, go ahead. That's good. Good. Okay. Okay. Oh, well. So.
Did anybody else have visions of an old string cartoon from like 40 years ago? Okay. So I do agree with Cullen that there is a little bit of nebulousness in the question, given that some people don't think the problem is well defined. This is really more for just a sense of what people are thinking here. But if there was work to be done here in the IETF, who would be active participants as either writing documents or reviewing documents? Please raise your hand.
I'd say about 3 dozen.
Two
to 3 dozen. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Alvaro, anything else you
And
want
for
to
the
know?
minute takers, that was about 2 to 3 dozen hands. Yep, thanks.
All right, any parting questions? The chair's plans going forward is we're going to sit down with Alvaro and have a discussion about what's been going on and what we take away from the session. Yeah.
Just a final question. Börje Ullman is my name. There was a short discussion on the IRSG mailing list discussing whether or not this was more suitable as a research group rather than a working group. I just want to like to hear having this discussion around not being well defined. It would be interesting to hear your thinking behind why you choose to ask for a working group rather than a research group.
Yeah.
Bob Moskowitz, I don't mean to put words in Dino's mouth, but Dino and I have been working this area for a long time. And I think we have maybe a little different view of what would benefit versus some of the other people. So there's going to be a little bit of negotiation coming together about how things are going to work in and what pieces are going to be done. So it is a little undefined right now as we're trying to shake out exactly what protocols or functionality and other things which need to be defined to get this to work. So the first level discussion is, how does this infrastructure work? What things are it providing? And how does it work? Then how do we then build around what IETF already has, what may be augmented, so that we can then deliver this particular functionality. So it is, yes, it's a little undefined. And you're right, Tim, that we have not taken this to the work group. We've been discussing side. That will be changing coming out of this meeting.
And one of the things that sort of we think about sometimes, at least I think about in the DNS space, is how would we solve this, if we were just a bunch of software hackers, who had no access to any sort of network protocols or anything like that? We would just write a bunch of code, and how would we do it, sort of thing, right? So I sort of, we sort of pose that question as well to get people sort of thinking, how would they sort of work around the whole problem if none of this actually existed, sort of thing. So.
And I have some answers to that.
Okay, good. I figured you did, Bob. So, that's all. Okay.
All right, any parting comments or questions?
This is Uma. There is a bits and bytes demo tomorrow for the proof of concept. I just encourage people to just have a look at what we are thinking about it on this.
Thank you. We put it on the slides and we forgot to mention that. Yeah, they've got a proof of concept on grids, basically. So show up tomorrow, see how it works, kick the tires.
All right. If that's not anything else, I'll give you 90 seconds of your time back, Georgios.
Okay, so we don't have time to go through the charter for a while.
Given that there's some questions about what would be the work items, I think it's not worthwhile to go through the charter item by item. I think that's something to discuss after the meeting with the area director.
I hope you post you will post the latest version that you guys have to the mailing list so folks can see it. Oh, you did? Okay, good. So
yeah,
thank you.
Yep, you throw stuff out there. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you for coming.
Oh, and blue sheets. If you haven't signed them, please find them. Who's got them? All that kind of good stuff. There, I see. Yep, I see some there. Thank you.